Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Rich from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 18 in the 50 most relevant is Port Adelaide's favourite son, Connor Rozee. A challenging year, a fulfilling year from a personal perspective for him, but from an AFL Fantasy SuperCoach and Dream Team point of view, didn't quite land the way we hoped. However, what will 2025 hold for us and for Connor? We will talk about that on this episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me is a man that he's a regular part of the Coaches Panel, but you haven't heard him yet this pre-season. We've broken the duck. He's finally come out after his injury hiatus. He's also part of the Pod family. It's Lewy, mate. Nice to have you back on the podcast. Welcome to the start of your pre-season.
No, thanks, mate. Great to be here. Always such a awesome piece of content every single year. And thrilled to be here talking about Connor Rozee, obviously a Port Adelaide fan. So I've got a soft spot for Connor Rozee.
As you absolutely should. Let's dive into what last year held for us with the viewpoint of what does it mean for us in 2025. A seasonal average last year of 97 in AFL Fantasy, meaning he's going to set you back almost $1 million across both AFL Fantasy and in Dream Team itself, while in SuperCoach. A 98.3 means he's coming at a price point for you of $529,400. 20 games last year, higher than you might think, right? Remember all those little challenging moments if you're a Rozee owner? Yeah, he still played 20 games last year with both seasonal and career high scores across the formats. Both in SuperCoach and AFL Fantasy, it came in the same game against the Western Bulldogs. In SuperCoach, the season and career high score was 168, while in AFL Fantasy, it was a 147. For a long time now, Lewy, we've just enjoyed owning Connor Rozee. Now, probably at his peak ownership, it's when he's been as a forward for us, like he was a few years ago. But he's moved into this Port Adelaide midfield. He's moved into this Port Adelaide leadership space. And he just does something to this midfield with some speed, some skill, some poise, some dare. Loves to kick the ball. The team loves to get the ball in his hands so he can take an uncontested mark and move this Port Adelaide ball movement forward. Now, for all the knocks you might have on him or Port Adelaide or anything around this football club, it is undeniable. Connor Rozee is one of the most enjoyable players to watch in the AFL right now.
Absolutely. And the flair that he's got is so good to watch. So when you own him in fantasy, it just makes it so much better. But yeah, in 2022 was when he first broke out, wasn't it, MJ, as a forward? And he went at about that 90 clip. He had a little bit of midfield time, but he was still a little bit behind sort of guys like Ollie Wines, Willem Drew at the time, even like Travis Stokes. And since then, there's been a little bit of a passing of the torch. 2023 had his breakout, went up to 106, which was predicted by a lot of coaches. He got that midfield time, went up to 69% CBAs. Which was substantial for what he'd gotten up to that point in his career, and he delivered. So that's why we're talking about him today, because 2024, which I'm sure we'll probably just talk about now, was a little bit of a up and down year for him. And you mentioned it wasn't necessarily through games missed, but just some little dinky injuries throughout that started to affect the form that he was able to put out on the field, as well as a little bit of personal stuff as well. So which one should we hit on first there, MJ?
Well, I think we should overview the 2024 season a little bit just to help us see exactly what that season held. So a 97 last year in fantasy. Look, there's still double-digit tons for us in that format and 3 over 120. So as much as we lament on it being not quite a great season, he's still got a greater than 50% conversion rate of games played to 100. So it's not a disaster for us in through there. While in SuperCoach, it is coming in that average of 98.3, again, 11 tons, 3 over 120. I think, Lewy, what we should do is look at last year in like quadrants for us, because therein lies two core elements. One, a block of games that he was injury impacted, which ultimately hurts. and then some ceiling about him that he probably doesn't get the credit for. Between rounds 1 to 5 last year, he goes 111.8 in AFL Fantasy and a 116 points in SuperCoach. Between rounds 6 to 14, a 65 in Fantasy and a 64.6 in SuperCoach. But there's 3 injury-impacted games. There's the game against the Saints and the game against the Crows, one where he had some hamstring awareness and the other where he out and out did it. Then when he comes back from those hamstring niggles, he hurts his ankle inside the first 10 minutes of a game against North Melbourne and just sits forward. So you can check the centre-bout starter trend through there. He's just not in that same normal role. He's literally just there being a warm body on the ground. He's not himself. Then the next 5 games, rounds 15 to 19, he goes 112 in SuperCoach and 112 in Fantasy. And then from rounds 20 to 24, a 99 in Fantasy and a 91.8 in SuperCoach. There's some interesting splits, and thankfully, Lewy, some clear narrative for why that kind of second block of games just seems so abnormal compared to what he normally is.
Yeah, it does, and it highlights to us exactly why we're talking about him, isn't it? So he regresses by about 9 points based on 2023, where he got 12 tons in a row in 2023, MJ. So this is a guy that can certainly score. You probably just hear my dog in the background there going nuts. So also to begin 2024, he had a few little personal issues too, which as a young player, 23 years old, is certainly going to affect you a little bit. First-year captain is the first one off the rank, which you've got that added responsibility, quite a young group at Port Adelaide. So he's lifting them on his shoulders. He's trying to find the grooves of, how to lead a young group like that. Had his first child and then obviously got married as well during the year. So he's had a few little personal things that he's had to deal with too, which, as we know, can affect our own form. We're not playing AFL footy, but is going to start to affect things in your everyday life. So I think we can spin a pretty good narrative here, MJ, on why there was a little bit of regression. And I think that's why the community as a whole, and he's quite highly selected, is excited about what he can potentially do in 2025. And how are we thinking that can look?
And I think that's got to be the conversation, because you do look at 2 of those splits that we went through of 2024. You look into 2023, you mentioned that 12 tons and a basic flat 105.9 average in Fantasy, a 107.6 average in SuperCoach, 13 tons. We're looking at his price point for us now. We look at a couple of those, better part of half of last season. And then 2023, we go, right, we've got 10 points per game of upside. I do want to ask you in a moment if that's enough across the formats. But the most intriguing conversation I'd like to have with you, Lewy, is again, as a keen follower of the pair, is I want to understand your take on this ball movement from Port Adelaide. Because while Dan Houston out might not feel intrinsically linked to Connor Rozee and the ball movement through the midfield, feel like there's a cascading impact there because, again, the narrative in the community is Houston out, a Farrell type assumes all that points. But how do you see this ball rebounding out of defensive 50? Because there's a way this could both help and hurt Connor Rozee.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting, that's for sure. Houston was such a large cog at Port Adelaide, and it pretty much meant that a lot of Port Adelaide's attacks were started from that half-back line under Dan Houston. And speaking to you pre-pod, MJ, I was surprised that you mentioned that Port's actually one of the lower disposal teams. But in hindsight, really, it probably shouldn't be a surprise because that's the game style they play. Dan Houston off that half-back with his booming leg. And then, obviously, in years past, they've had a Charlie Dixon there, which they've gotten into a bit of a habit of bombing onto his head. So I think we're going to see a little bit of a game style change in 2025. In fact, it's actually been spoken about publicly and behind the scenes a little bit. So we're going to find out more details as we play a few of those community matches. And then obviously round 1 onwards is still going to be a bit of a learning process. But I think what we'll see is that they start to attack from the midfield a lot more and they identify their targets going inside 50 with, They want to. They can't just bob it onto the head of a Jack Lukosius and Mitch Georgiades. or any of the other forwards down there. I think they're going to be wanting to get into the hands of players like your Connor Rozee, Jason Horne-Francis, and a Zach Butters, who have shown that when kicking inside 50, they can hit up those targets effectively. And what it also means is that they're just going to be able to control the ball a little bit more instead of what we saw in 2024, where the ball goes right back over their heads and they're chasing tail defensively. So I think that bodes well for Connor Rozee, and I think it bodes well for Port. I think we're going to see an increase in fantasy scoring as a whole, as a team. And for me, I think that's going to go on top of those midfielders' heads.
Yeah, well, they're 6th in the AFL for marks, but they're 15th for disposals. Now, those two pure stats aren't going to be enough for the SuperCoach community, because now they're like, well, where are those disposals happening? How effective are they? Those marks, are they contested? Are those intercepts? But rather just putting that up on the stilts at the top of this episode as we talk about Port Adelaide's ball movement, how much opportunity. They're above the AFL average by about 3 or 4 marks per game, but they're about 10 disposals below the AFL average per game. And you talk about this potential evolving game style. I think the Dixon out, chop out that they've kind of had, which is, it doesn't matter how we get the ball inside forward 50, let's just get it in there. Now you've got players like Georgiadis and Lukosius who are better on the lead. They're fine overhead, but they're better when the ball is being presented to them, as a lot of forwards are. The arrival of Berry is now going to just support Willie Rioli with another pressure forward. So if they can change that ball movement through the midfield and be a little bit more precise and intentional with their ball movement and actually give their forwards a chance to compete, well, between that and a lack of rebound that could come with the Dan Houston out, because I just don't think any team can't replace an all-Australian caliber player like a Dan Houston. Again, to come back to that, whether it's Farrell, whether it's Bergman, whether it's Burton, whether it's Evans, someone's going to assume a degree of that disposal opportunity for sure. But we can't just assume, Louis, can we, that Port Adelaide have a player waiting in the wings that can immediately step into the same role at the same skill set with the same ability, and we see nothing change.
No, that's it. I think Farrell's probably been identified as that player, but you're never going to be able to just replace that sort of player. So we'll see how that turns out. I also think with the game style that there's probably going to be more stoppages inside Port's 50 if it's not going straight back out due to bombing it in. So that should be advantageous. You mentioned the marks. Marks probably come down a little bit. Handballs probably go a little bit up.
Whether you're ordering wings for the game, whipping up a 7-layer dip, or ordering pizza, there's something about football that makes you want to eat. And this football season, Uber Eats has the best deals on game day food. No matter what you're craving, from 2-for-1 pizza to buy one, get one wings, Uber Eats will be dropping new deals each week, all season long. Uber Eats, official on-demand delivery partner of the NFL. Order now. Terms and conditions apply. See app for details.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's interesting. He's not in unrealistic territories in a couple of these areas now to really bump and to grow for us, let alone if he can just return back to the healthy version of Connor in 2023 and the healthy version of Connor that we saw in 2024. He's got about 10 points per game based on previous years to price point. And there's a lot of reasons why the AFL fantasy community are keen on him. SuperCoach are interested. I wouldn't say they're as bullish as the AFL fantasy community are, but they've got some interest. I'm curious, we talked about 103 averages, 105 averages based on the past couple of years. Is that enough for us at this price point, given we're going to get not a huge amount of money on top of him in terms of cash generation? We got a bunch of guys that are in this sort of $700,000 to $900,000 range, the Cheras, the Peatlings, the Dohertys, the Days. I could just go on. I feel like that's all we've done in the 50 most relevant is talk about this mid-range value spot. Is Connor going to do enough for us with 10 points per game and small money making, given we could be getting considerable more at $100,000, $200,000 cheaper, depending on the format you play?
Oh, well, I think if he's going 10 points upside, MJ, you're laughing. At least in AF coming in at 97, if you're going at a 107, the top scoring midfielder in 2024 went at 110. So you've got yourself a keeper there. You've already picked the value, and you've saved yourself a trade essentially. So I think if you can get 10 points upside out of Connor Rozee, you're taking it to the bank every day of the week. I think 105 starts to become a little bit more on the nose, but you take that still, 8 points upside from a guy that you're essentially picking to be a premium. Things could go a lot worse, couldn't they? When you get upside at this end of the spectrum, you're generally pretty happy. I think if he lands in that 102 range, then that's no man's land. He's not poor enough that you're trying to shift him out immediately, but he's not really good enough that he can occupy that spot. So in turn, he ends up hanging around in your midfield for a little bit too long, perhaps.
Yeah.
I'm fairly confident on 10 points upside here, though. MJ, what about you?
Yeah, in AFL Fantasy, I am too. Just the health of what he's been over the better part of 40 to 50 AFL games tells me that he's not losing this midfield spot. There are other dynamics that will move ahead of him, and I do want to ask you about Jason Horne-Francis in a moment. But there's other dynamics that are around this that I just don't see that chaotically poor. I think the marks might drop away a fraction, as you mentioned, but if that takes place, that'll mean a higher stoppage game, and we should ultimately see him be able to replicate through disposals and through tackles, maybe some of that loss in 1 or 2 marks per game that might come his way. So anyone that's around the ball as much as he is, anyone that's as damaging with the ball in hand as he is, anyone that's still a goal-kicking midfielder, not just an accumulator or a clearance player. To me, he is their leader for a number of different reasons. I think in AFL Fantasy, he's got that 10 points on him. SuperCoach, I think he's probably got about 10 points as well, but he needs to go closer to the 110 part for it to feel really successful to me. So if you believe what he did in rounds 1 to 5 last year and rounds 15 to 19, where he goes 116 and 120 in SuperCoach, is what he can do to start the year, well, now all of a sudden it's well and truly worth it. But you've got to be confident that you're hitting that mid-season buy with a guy that's knocking and banging on the door of a 110 average, not just a 105. Otherwise, you're just missing out a little bit, because the proven options we've got below Connor that are cheaper for a reason, like everyone's cheap for a reason, I feel like you need that 110. So if you don't think he's got that in SuperCoach, you're probably fading to start with, but there's absolutely a clear way that can land. I want to ask you about Jason Horne-Francis, because we have talked about the rebound of the ball movement and how that might impact the midfield. Talk to me about this mid-forward split of Jason Horne-Francis. Again, it might not feel directly linked to a Connor Rozee, but that forward line hasn't really gelled brilliantly. Now, I think there's some positive signs. We've alluded to a Joe Berry at the draft. I think Willie Rioli's an underrated small. Georgiadis on his day looks imposing. Jack Lukosius, I think we forget how clean of a ball user and how good a set shot he is at goal when he's forward 50 of the ball. Let's hope and pray Todd Marshall can get some health into him. And all of a sudden, this forward line looks powerful and potent in a number of different areas. Does Horne-Francis need to have a heavy mid-forward split? Not choose to, but have to have that, because the more Horne-Francis is out of that midfield, you could greatly assume that there's a greater share of points available for a player like Rozee.
It's a tough question to answer, MJ. Obviously, Horne-Francis is so effective when he sits forward. He generally jags a goal or two. I think Port has certainly strengthened up their forward line. So if I'm looking at it, how they're going to line up in round 1, obviously you're going to have Lukosius and Georgiadis. You're going to have Rioli and Richards. Pau Pepper will probably make it to the line, and maybe a Burn Jones as well, with the Joe Berry sort of swapping out. There's not a lot of room there. It's going to be interesting, that midfield mix of Wines, Rozee, Butters, Horne-Francis, Drew. The coaches definitely have their work cut out for them. No doubt one of them will be resting forward while the others are in the midfield. But it's an impossible question to answer, really, isn't it, MJ? I think Horne-Francis is the more effective forward, so he's the one that's more likely to go there. I think Rosie's going to be that guy in the middle that is a bit of a stalwart. He's the captain, leads by example, and I think he'll spend the most amount of time there alongside Butters. And like we said, if they're going to be having repeat stoppages up forward, then they're going to have plenty of times to pepper the sticks too.
Yeah, it's so true. If you look at it from just a pure market share perspective, in terms of a pure AFL fantasy points, the market share is so heavy towards Zach Butters. He's the leader with just 6.5, so heavy is a little bit of a hyperbolic sentiment there. Connor Rozee's at 6.2, and now the departed to Magpies, Dan Houston at 6. They're the only three guys going at 6. So it's not exactly a crazy high number of market share, and his centre-bounce rate is not exactly high either. Butters is at 66, Rozee's at 62, Drew and Wines are identical at 56, and Horne-Francis at 54. So you're right, it's a pretty even share of how this all kind of works out. And if any of these one or two elements break Connor's way of, okay, less rebound that goes over and the midfield now comes through the midfield with the departure of Dan Houston. A little bit more forward split of Horne-Francis either out of necessity or desire to be able to make that forward line even more compelling. A little bit of a dynamic change to, no, we want Connor closer to that 70-75% and abouts. All it takes is one thing to break his way, and I think they're more likely to break his way than against his way, that could see not only that 10 points per game of upside come his way, but also the pathway to potentially just that little bit more. If we talk about where he goes on draft day, though, Louis, on the Keeper platform is where the coaches panel chooses to draft in 2025, whether it be for a single season, a keeper or dynasty league. That is where you will find the coaches panel drafting in 2025. If people draft by average as a sentiment, and again, they'll either draft off preseason hype or average for 80% of the community, and there's sort of that 20% that do the ranks and the research and really put that hard work in depth. If it's going by that, he's ranked the 22nd mid in fantasy by average, where you take DPP guys out of it, and 33rd in SuperCoach. So that's what a very early M3 in fantasy and a very early M in SuperCoach. Is that about right? Or should you be wanting to jump a little bit early to ensure you get it?
It's probably about right, but hype's going to take over here, and I think he's going to go a bit earlier than that. So if you're really bullish and you're keen and you want him in your team, I think round 2 is probably when you're going to have to jump.
Yeah, I think definitely in AFL fantasy, that's as early as he goes. And you've got to be really bullish on that 105. I think you can afford to wait to the 3rd in AFL fantasy, but as you've mentioned, if the hype continues to build, and depending on when you do your draft, all it takes is him for absolute dominator preseason game, which are largely pretty bruise-free, and that helps his game style in terms of lots of easy marks, lots of open space, lots of ball movement. That could absolutely skyrocket him to the moon. So I think if you're hoping for him to land at an M3 in fantasy and M4 in SuperCoach, you're going to miss him. If you desperately want him, you need to go for that position early, which is an M2 in fantasy and M3 in SuperCoach, if you really want to own him. Hey, Louis, as always, mate, an absolute pleasure talking fantasy footy with you. Who knows, we might squeeze you in one last time as we get to, we're inside the final few weeks of the 50 most relevant. It is getting real close to these pre-season games now. Hey, thank you so much for being a part of the panel and being back on the 50 most relevant.
Thanks for having me, mate. Can't wait. Top 10 not far away, so it's we're getting down to the sticky end now.
Yeah, we absolutely are. If you want to check out any of the players in the 50 most relevant that we have revealed so far, maybe you're like Louis and you're just coming out of your pre-season injury phase, jump back in there. There's over 30 episodes. There is 17 hours worth of conversations to go back and check out. There's videos, so if you're watching this on YouTube, nice to see you. Comment below, what's Connor going to average? Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Or you can go back and listen to the audio podcast wherever you're tuning in on this platform. The whole series is there. If you haven't given us a 5-star rating, take that 3 seconds out of your day. Give us a 5-star rating. It makes a huge impact for us here at the Coaches Panel, and something we greatly appreciate. In about 15 seconds, I got a clue for you. Who's at number 17? I wonder who it could be. But if you haven't subscribed to the Patreon yet, we'd love you to do so. If you haven't followed and got in touch with us across social media or got your hands yet on some Coaches Panel merch, the good news, you could do all those things right now with the details inside the description of this episode. We'd love you to jump on board and do it. All right, number 17 in the 50 most relevant is potentially a player that might be the reason you don't pick Connor Rozee. No, it's not another Port Adelaide player, although there may and should be still a couple to come in the countdown. But it's the kind of guy you might be looking at in a position in your team going, well, I could get Rozee, who I know will be good, I know will deliver around this marker, and I think that might be enough. Or I could go a little bit cheaper and get someone that has proven to be even better than what Connor has been to date. Not just once, but multiple times. Who's the guy that you might choose instead of Rozee because there's a perception of greater upside, there's a history of greater upside, and he's cheaper? Who am I talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.